Welcome to Episode 8 of the Psychological Safety Series, brought to you by Healthcare Nurses Network and the Nurses Link Up app, where we continue our conversation on creating environments where trust, open communication, and emotional security thrive. In this episode, hosts James Carter, BSN, RN, an ICU nurse with frontline experience in high-pressure environments, and Emily Ramirez, MSN, RN, a nurse manager passionate about fostering open communication, discussed the article written by Dr. Nicolas Abella titled How to Sustain Psychological Safety in Work and Life. You may have worked hard to establish psychological safety in your workplace, professional networks, and personal relationships, but maintaining it over time presents new challenges. Have you noticed that a once collaborative team has become more hesitant to speak up? Have minor conflicts or miscommunications created distance in relationships that used to feel secure? Do high-stress environments make it harder to preserve psychological safety? Research confirms that psychological safety is not a one-time achievement. It must be continuously reinforced through intentional leadership, ongoing communication, and structured strategies. Without this effort, trust can erode, teams can regress into silence, and relationships can weaken over time. In this episode, we will explore: why does psychological safety fade if it is not actively maintained? Common barriers that cause trust to deteriorate in workplaces and relationships. Evidence-based strategies to reinforce and sustain psychological safety in professional and personal environments. How healthcare teams, leaders, and individuals can proactively nurture psychological safety to keep it strong over time. Whether you are a nurse, a healthcare professional, a leader, or someone who values psychological safety in your relationships, this discussion will provide practical tools to ensure that trust and open communication remain a lasting part of your environment. Now, let's join James Carter and Emily Ramirez as they explore how to sustain psychological safety in work and life.
Welcome back to the Healthcare Nurses Network podcast, where we're all about giving you the insights and strategies that can really make a difference in your nursing journey.
Absolutely.
And today we're diving deep into something super important. We're talking about sustaining psychological safety.
Yeah.
Now, we know this is so crucial for teams to thrive, but honestly, it can be really tricky to keep it going strong over time.
You've probably heard a lot about what psychological safety is, right? That sense of trust, where everyone feels comfortable speaking up, sharing ideas, even admitting mistakes without that fear of being judged.
Right. And I bet a lot of our listeners have worked so hard to build that within their teams too.
Exactly.
But here's the thing, and this is what today's deep dive is all about: psychological safety. It isn't a set it and forget it kind of deal.
It really isn't.
It's more like a plant,
right?
It needs the extending a little bit of sunlight, the right environment, or it's just going to wilt.
Exactly. And we're going to unpack why that happens. Let's take a look at 4 main reasons why psychological safety can fade, even in teams that seem solid.
Okay. Hit me with reason number 1.
Unresolved conflict.
Okay.
It's rarely the big blow-ups that sabotage safety. It's those simmering tensions.
Interesting.
Imagine 2 nurses disagreeing on patient care,
Okay.
but neither one of them feels comfortable addressing it directly.
Oh, I've seen that happen.
That tension builds, and it impacts communication.
Yeah.
And before you know it, the whole team dynamic is strained.
Wow.
It's like a tiny crack in a bridge. You ignore it, it can eventually weaken the entire structure.
That makes total sense. Those little things can really fester.
They do.
What's the second culprit?
Leader complacency.
Oh.
It's easy to think, okay, we did a workshop on psychological safety, we're good.
Right, we checked that box.
But just like that plant, it needs ongoing attention.
Okay.
If leaders just assume that it's a one-time achievement,
Uh-huh.
the team can slide back into those old habits of holding back and not speaking up.
So it's not just about creating that safe space initially, but actively maintaining it.
Absolutely. No, reason number 3, and this is a big one for nurses: high-stress situations.
Okay.
When the pressures on fear can easily override trust.
Yeah.
Think about it in a code blue. Are you more likely to speak up if you're worried about being judged, or if you know your team has your back no matter what?
That's a huge difference. And in those moments, feeling safe to speak up can literally be life-saving.
It can.
Okay, so what's the last reason things can go sideways?
Simply put, lack of reinforcement.
Okay.
If you don't intentionally nurture psychological safety, it fades into the background.
It's like anything else. We value relationships,
Yeah.
skills, even our own well-being. Without consistent effort, they weaken over time.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got a pretty clear picture of the why. Now let's talk about solutions. You mentioned a framework.
Yes.
Tell us more about that.
We call it the STAY framework. It's
Yeah.
4 pillars for sustaining psychological safety.
I love a good framework. Walk us through it, starting with S.
S is for structure. Remember how we said psychological safety needs that ongoing care?
Yes.
This is where you build it into the system. One hospital unit in our research actually does a monthly psychological safety pulse check.
Oh, wow.
Nurses give anonymous feedback on any concerns. Leaders address them openly, and they even celebrate examples of speaking up.
I love that.
It makes it a regular part of how they operate.
That's brilliant, like building it into the DNA of the unit. What's T all about?
Tackle small issues. That is before they snowball.
Okay.
If you as a leader see tension brewing between nurses and physicians, don't ignore it.
Right.
Organize a roundtable with a neutral facilitator. Get things out in the open in a constructive way. It's way easier to deal with a weed when it's small than when it's taken over the garden.
So true. Okay, A's got to be amplify.
Right.
Turning up the volume on something good.
You got to amplify emotional intelligence and self-awareness to be precise.
Okay.
We all have to be mindful of how we show up. Imagine a supervisor who records meetings and realizes they interrupt constantly and their tone is dismissive.
Oh, yeah.
They work on asking open-ended questions and really listening.
I see.
That self-awareness creates a safer space for everyone.
Wow, that's powerful stuff. Leaders really set the tone. Okay, bring us home with why.
Why is for year-round. Psychological safety isn't a seasonal thing.
Right.
Think about a nurse educator introducing structured debriefings after medical errors, not about blame, but learning that year-round commitment makes speaking up the norm even in tough situations.
The STAY framework. I love how actionable that is. I'm already thinking about where I could implement this.
That's great. And we're going to dig even deeper into each of these pillars, giving you real strategies and tips you can use right away.
Perfect.
But first, we want to address a common thought we hear a lot from nurses.
Which is, don't leave us hanging.
We'll be right back after this quick word from our sponsors. Welcome back to the Healthcare Nurses Network podcast. Before the break, we were talking about the STAY framework.
Right. A really practical approach to sustaining psychological safety. But I know some of our listeners might be thinking, hey, my team already feels pretty safe. Do I really need all this? What do you say to that?
It's a great question. And it's tempting to think, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But research shows that even in high-functioning teams, trust and safety can erode over time if they're not actively reinforced.
So even when things seem good on the surface, there's always room for improvement.
Absolutely. It's like anything else we value our health relationships, skills we have to put in consistent effort to maintain them. Psychological safety is no different.
So what are some signs that psychological safety might be slipping, even if it's not super obvious?
Well, one thing to look out for is a decrease in engagement. Are people less willing to speak up in meetings, share ideas, or ask questions that can be an early warning sign?
Like they're starting to hold back a bit, maybe second-guessing themselves.
Exactly. Another sign is an increase in defensiveness. Are people quick to get defensive when they receive feedback, or are they more focused on protecting themselves than learning and growing?
Those are definitely red flags. It suggests people might be feeling less safe to be vulnerable.
Right. And keep an ear out for an increase in gossip or side conversations. If people are talking about issues behind each other's backs instead of addressing them directly, it could be a sign of eroding trust.
That makes sense. They don't feel safe enough to bring things up in the open.
Exactly. And all of this can happen even in teams that seem to have a good culture on the surface. So being proactive is key.
Okay, so we know the signs. What can we do about it? How do we prevent that erosion from happening in the first place?
First and foremost, keep those lines of communication open. Don't assume everything's fine just because you haven't heard any complaints regularly. Check in with your team, both formally and informally. Ask open-ended questions like, what's one thing you're feeling good about and one thing that's challenging you this week? That simple act of asking creates space for people to voice concerns.
Those regular check-ins are a big part of the STAY framework, right?
They are, and they don't have to be super formal. Even just having an open door policy, letting people know they can come to you with anything, can make a huge difference.
So it's about creating that constant sense of accessibility and openness.
Absolutely. And the tackle part of stay is crucial here too. Don't let those small issues fester. Even a miscommunication or a misunderstanding, if left unaddressed, can create resentment and erode trust over time.
So how do we tackle effectively, what are your top tips for addressing those smaller conflicts before they blow up?
Pay attention to those early warning signs we talked about. If you notice someone being withdrawn or defensive, address it directly. And it's often best to do this privately, one-on-one, rather than calling them out in front of everyone.
That makes it less confrontational, gives them a chance to open up, honestly.
Exactly. And when you do have that conversation, approach it with curiosity, not judgment. Instead of saying, why are you being so defensive? Try something like, I'm sensing some resistance here. Help me understand where it's coming from.
That's a great example. It shifts the focus from blame to understanding.
Right. Remember, the goal is to resolve the issue and strengthen the relationship, not to win an argument.
Okay, so communication is key, but we've also talked about leadership playing a huge role. What can nurse leaders do specifically to sustain psychological safety on their units?
Well, first and foremost, they need to model the behavior they want to see. That means being vulnerable themselves, admitting mistakes, asking for feedback, and being open to different perspectives.
It's that walk the talk idea, actions speak louder than words, especially when it comes to building trust.
Exactly. Leaders also need to be proactive about creating systems and structures that support psychological safety. This could include things like regular team debriefings, anonymous feedback mechanisms, and clearer guidelines for conflict resolution.
And so it's not just about individual actions, but creating a whole environment that fosters psychological safety.
That's right. And it's also important for leaders to celebrate examples of people speaking up, taking risks, and learning from mistakes. When people see those behaviors being rewarded, they're more likely to emulate them.
It creates a positive feedback loop, right? Reinforcing the culture you're trying to build.
Exactly. And of course, leaders need to be mindful of their own communication styles and how they impact others. We talked earlier about that supervisor who realized they were interrupting and being dismissive. That kind of self-awareness is critical for creating a safe space for everyone to contribute.
So much of it comes back to that amplify pillar, building that emotional intelligence and self-awareness. But it's not just on leaders, is it? What about individual nurses? What can we do to contribute to it as a more psychologically safe environment?
That's a great question. And you're right. Everyone on the team has a role to play for individual nurses. One of the most important things is to practice self-awareness as well. Think about how your own behaviors and communication style might be impacting others.
Right, like, am I accidentally shutting people down? Am I being too quick to judge?
Exactly. And be willing to own up to your mistakes when you do that. You're modeling vulnerability and creating a safer space for others to do the same.
It can be tough to admit we're wrong, especially in a high-pressure environment like healthcare, but it's so powerful when we do.
It really is. And another thing individual nurses can do is to be active listeners, really hear and value the perspectives of others, even if you don't agree with them.
That's a skill we could all probably use more of in all areas of life.
For sure. And don't be afraid to speak up, even when it's difficult. If you see something that's not right or if you have a concerned voice, remember, silence can be interpreted as agreement.
That's a powerful reminder. We have a responsibility to speak up both for ourselves and for our colleagues.
Absolutely. And finally, just be kind and respectful to one another. Treating each other with compassion and empathy goes a long way in creating a positive and supportive environment.
So true. It's the foundation of any healthy team dynamic.
This has been such a great conversation. I hope our listeners are feeling empowered to take action and sustain psychological safety in their own teams.
Me too. And speaking of taking action, we have an amazing resource for you. We were just talking about how everyone can contribute to a psychologically safe environment. And speaking of resources, we have an amazing one for you.
We do.
Our website, healthcarenurses.net, is packed with articles, tools, even case studies on building and sustaining psychological safety. It's like a one-stop shop for all things nursing and well-being.
It is.
And if you are looking for a sense of connection and support, don't forget about our Nurses Link Up app.
Yes.
It's available on Apple and Google Play, and it's a fantastic way to connect with other nurses who get it, share experiences, and just, feel that sense of camaraderie. It's like having a whole community of nurses in your pocket.
It is.
Ready to offer support and encouragement.
Absolutely.
So we want to wrap up today's deep dive by addressing some of the common pushback we hear about sustaining psychological safety. Because let's face it, sometimes it's easier to just maintain the status quo.
Right. Yeah, if things seem like they're going okay, why rock the boat?
Right, exactly. But we know that complacency can be a slippery slope.
It really can.
So let's tackle those objections head on first. Up the classic, but my team already feels safe. What do you say to that?
Well, I would start by acknowledging that they've clearly done a great job, creating a positive culture. But even the strongest teams benefit from regular check-ins and proactive efforts to sustain psychological safety.
It's like preventative maintenance for your car.
Exactly.
Get it serviced regularly to prevent breakdowns, right?
It,
Same idea here. We're preventing those cracks from forming in the first place.
it really highlights how those check-ins aren't about finding problems. They're about ensuring that trust and that openness remains strong over time.
Now, what about the folks who say, but people naturally resolve conflicts on their own. We don't need structured processes. How do we respond to that?
I would gently challenge that assumption. While some conflicts do resolve naturally, many don't. And those unresolved conflicts, even seemingly minor ones, can fester and erode trust over time. By addressing those small issues early on in a structured and supportive way, we prevent them from becoming bigger problems down the road that could damage relationships and really harm the team as a whole.
So it's not about suppressing conflict, but about having those healthy mechanisms in place for resolving it.
Exactly.
And finally, there's self-awareness is a personal issue, not a workplace. One argument, some folks just don't see the connection.
Yeah, that keep your feelings out of work mentality.
Exactly.
I'd emphasize that while self-awareness is a personal journey, it has a huge impact on how we interact with others in the workplace. Leaders who are self-aware create safer environments because they're more attuned to how their words and actions affect other people.
And they model empathy, vulnerability, and respect.
Absolutely.
All essential ingredients for psychological safety.
All is.
So we're bringing it full circle back to that idea that everyone has a role to play in sustaining psychological safety.
It takes a village.
It does. And the rewards are huge.
They are.
When we feel psychologically safe, we're more engaged, more creative, and more resilient. We're better able to provide compassionate care to our patients and support each other through challenging times.
Absolutely.
This has been such an inspiring conversation. I feel like we've given our listeners a lot to think about and some concrete tools to take action.
Me too.
Remember, the STAY framework structure, tackle, amplify year-round, is your roadmap. Choose one area of your life where you want to strengthen psychological safety and pick one strategy from STAY to implement. Start small, be consistent, and observe those positive ripple effects that it creates.
You got it.
And don't forget about all the amazing resources available to support you, including the Healthcare Nurses Network website, healthcarenurses.net, and the Nurses Link Up app, available on Apple and Google Play.
You're not alone on this journey.
You're all in this together. We are, and together we can create a more psychologically safe and supportive world for nurses and everyone we care for. Thank you for listening to the Healthcare Nurses Network podcast.